Hello! So, I have got a trigger warning for today's episode of contraception, conception, and pregnancy. So, by now, it's been 4 weeks since I escaped, and the abuse hasn't really stopped. Whilst he has gotten a line of communication open, he is able to accuse, insult, vent, threaten, and lie to me. The only real difference is that he can't physically intimidate me, but despite the distance, he was still very much in my life and still had a lot of control over my thought patterns, reactions, and what was going to happen next. He had my dog and all of mine and my daughter's belongings. He was 50% of the business, and he was living in the house that we were jointly liable for. And I was carrying his baby. The prompt for today's episode is just a single text message. And before I share what that message said, I think the time's probably come for me to share the story of how I found out I was pregnant. I suppose to give a bit of context to that, it would be important to share how I found out I was pregnant with my eldest daughter. And as I mentioned in the last episode, I'd never planned to have children, and so I took the contraceptive pill. At the time, we were running the first restaurant and it was so busy I barely had time to eat. Yet in the April of that year, I couldn't help but think I'd put on weight around my stomach. I tend to gain weight on my thighs first, and in one of those click, 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 everything falling into place moments, my first reaction was, shit, am I pregnant? Later that day, I made an excuse to go to the supermarket and I discreetly bought a double pack of pregnancy tests. And then that night, I waited until he had had his usual fill of lager and 2 bottles of red wine and had passed out in bed before I snuck into the bathroom at 4 o'clock in the morning and I peed on the stick. The second line on that test appeared instantly, and I was confronted with something that I certainly had not considered part of the plan. The next day, I waited until his hangover had semi-lifted and sat down and told him he was over the moon, and I wasn't sure what to think. I wanted to know how far along I was before we made any decisions and to give myself some time to let this all sink in. But by 8 o'clock that night, he'd already told one of our staff members, and so I put on a brave face and I smoked my last cigarette for a while. And because it was the weekend and I hadn't even registered at the local doctors, on the Monday morning I telephoned for a new patient appointment. When I went for that appointment, I told the nurse that I'd had this positive test, and we tried to hazard a guess at a conception date. The pill I was on stopped periods altogether, so it really was a stab in the dark, but she was adamant I gave her a time scale. And so we guessed at like 8 to 10 weeks, and she said that the midwife would be in touch to arrange a booking appointment. Now, when the midwife telephoned later that day, she didn't have any appointments for around 4 weeks. She ran her clinics on a Monday, and with 2 bank holidays in May, there was nothing for a while, and I needed to know how far along I was. I had a business to run, and Christmas was 7 months away, and so I needed to know ASAP what the year had in store for us in terms of timescales. So I booked a private scan, and that weekend we headed up to the private sonographer who dated the baby at 17 to 18 weeks. I was 4 months pregnant already. Now, fast forward to December 2019, and I had just returned home after my 6th attempt to leave Mr. C. It was Christmas time, and I had fallen for his love bombing and false promises once again. I felt guilty that he would be alone for the holidays, and we had both agreed that 2020 would be a year for change. I was well and truly under that spell again, and I believed that everything we had been through, that next year had to be our year where he would address the issues that caused his abusive behaviour, and I would be better able to support him as I had a better understanding of what he was going through. We spoke for hours and hours about all of his issues, and I couldn't tell you why, and it came as a total surprise to me when it came out of my mouth. But at one point I even said that I had a feeling our family would grow one day. But to my mind, we both knew we had a lot of work to do first, and we didn't talk about that again. So 1 month later, I went to a routine smear exam, and It won't come as a surprise to many of you, but the month since reuniting at Christmas and all the promises, things hadn't got much better. There hadn't been any outbursts or rows, but the tension was still there. I spent my life on eggshells, and I was always within earshot of my phone in case he called me from work. If I let it ring too long, I would have to explain what I'd been doing, and so I was never more than 5 paces away from my phone, which obviously had me living in a state of survival, really. The evenings were filled with reviews of his state of mind and suggestions of the things I could be doing to make things easier for him and ensure that his mood remained stable. So when I went for the smear, and once I was in the examination room, the nurse asked me how I was, a mum from the school that my daughter is at, and I told her that I was okay. A part of me wanted to tell her what was going on at home, but I didn't really know how to articulate it, and where would I even start? I did mention that I'd been experiencing hot sweats in the night, and if I'm honest, I thought they were related to stress. So when she asked me when I'd had my last period, I was stumped because I couldn't remember. I had a copper coil fitted after my daughter was born, and I understandably had very little faith in the contraceptive pill, so I opted for a copper coil that I had fitted 2 weeks after she was born and rested safe in the knowledge that there wouldn't be any more surprises. So she'd asked me when this last period was, and I sat and thought for a little while, and I couldn't remember having one since November. But with all the stress of leaving and coming back at Christmas and not having particularly regular periods on the copper coil, I hadn't given it a second thought. She asked if I wanted to take a test, and I said, well, I better had, now that she'd mentioned it, as my daughter was conceived on the pill. And I also jokingly said, I want to be able to sleep tonight. But I was pretty sure it would be negative. The intimacy in our relationship was less than regular, as he ran hot and cold from being too tired and too stressed, or accusing me of not showing him enough affection or instigating sex. It was all more crazy-making behaviour to keep me under control and unsure what was going on from one day to the next. And the truth is, I spent a lot of time contemplating leaving, and having already tried these 6 times, I was definitely living in denial that things would get better at this point. And the nurse got the test, and I peed in the pot. I went back into the examination room, and she suggested I prepared for the smear while she did the test, and we'd give it a few minutes whilst it developed, multitasking at its best. And so I got onto the bed, and I just heard the nurse let out a high-pitched, right, we'll give that a few minutes, and I knew. The tone of her voice told me everything, and the speed at which that second line had appeared that night in the toilet nearly 6 years ago came rushing back, and I was pregnant again. So what did the message say that prompted me to share this story today? It said, Eve, as you are aware, I've been left with a lot of unanswered questions in my life, and it's contributed to my lack of trust. When you came back at Christmas, you voiced to me that there may be chance of some more children. I remember how agitated you seemed at the time. You couldn't sit still, and a month later you were pregnant. I knew that you immediately saw that as a miracle and seemed unfazed by it. To think that this wasn't in some way planned is unrealistic. Given the chances of conceiving anyway with the copper coil, and then mentioning when you came back from a temporary separation, it seems coincidence is too great. I know that you will see this as doubt, or me somehow clutching at straws. But because of what was said and how this happened, I would like proof. So I don't have yet another doubt for life to deal with while I'm recovering. I somehow doubt it, but I hope you'll understand and not use it against me when presented with it. Unfortunately, turning on me the way you have has only compounded my doubt. We had so much, and yet on your behalf it seems we had so little. This man could get a PhD in playing the victim, and his capacity to flip things around was quite frankly remarkable. But here I was again, having to prove what we both knew to be true and answer accusations that were not only unfounded, they were impossible. And that's the end of today's episode. Thank you for watching. I hope you have enjoyed hearing the story of my little miracles. And if you've recently joined on this journey, then please do go back and have a look at some of the previous episodes to learn more about me and the abusive relationship from which I escaped. And if you want to find out what happens next, be sure to subscribe, turn on your notifications, or if you're not already a member, join the Facebook group where we will enjoy some discussions around this episode, and you can connect with others who have experienced abuse in a safe and supportive environment. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I shall see you soon.